And so that great irony also marked Haiti's history. The ransom that France demanded was 150 million gold francs, which was a huge sum in that day. It would be the equivalent today of billions of dollars. And in fact, that is what, just to flash ahead for a moment, one of the things that got President Jean-Bertrand Aristide in such hot water in 2003, about 7 years ago, when he went to France and was, for the first time, he was the first nation to demand reparations from a former colonial power. Because France had a few years before recognized that slavery and colonialism were crimes against humanity. And so Aristide said, okay, if that's going to be anything more than just words, prove it. We've done the tabulations, and essentially the 90 million gold francs that we ended up paying you, in the course of time it was reduced down a bit. It took the country from 1825 till 1947 to pay that money. Fully half of the country's treasury was poured into paying this debt. They carried this onerous debt. And so he asked for a reparation. He said, the bill for it comes to $21 billion and change. So keep your aid. You don't need to give us aid. Just pay us back for this money that your ancestors stole from us. And that was one of the reasons why Chirac let loose the dogs on Haiti and joined with the US in the coup d'etat against Aristide in 2004. But we'll come back to that. 1862, Haiti was finally recognized by the United States, but here is a country which is surrounded, embargoed, sabotaged. You had the European colonial powers of the time emerging as neo-colonial powers and trying to carve out spheres of influence. The Germans were regularly landing, and the Spanish and English. There were all sorts of episodes all during this period, and lots of coups. Haiti's own ruling class developed something like this, where you had a bourgeoisie in the cities, not a traditional bourgeoisie, which means a bourgeoisie which invests in factories and develops industry, etc., but what is called a comprador bourgeoisie, an import-export bourgeoisie. They would buy the products from overseas, the manufactured products, and sell them in the country, and then take the agricultural products of the country, mostly sugar and coffee, cacao, and sell it overseas. So they were middlemen. And the other head of the ruling class in Haiti was the grandons, the big landowners. But they weren't big like you see in Latin America, latifundia with huge expanses of land. No, they were smaller. They had small plots. Oftentimes their tenants were their cousins and their nephews, even their children. And these small plots would be farmed by that farmer, and then part of that product would be given to the landowner in the form of coffee, often, or sugar, or whatever could be sold. So it was almost a sharecropping, what was called in Creole de moitié, two halves system. It wasn't really halves because the landowner got far more than the peasant got. Anyway, this caused friction as these two groups vied for power through the latter half of the 19th century. Coups on coups. There were two parties. You see this throughout a lot of Latin America. The Liberal Party, which was the bourgeoisie's party, and then the National Party, which was the party of the big landowners. Their slogan was power to the greatest number. And the slogan of the Liberal Party was power to the most competent. You know, and generally the bourgeoisie had more affinity to the European people that they were the intermediaries for. And the landowners tended to use more demagoguery and say, well, we're part of the masses, the people, but it was just words. 1915, the U.S. finally put an end to all the vying between the different imperial gunboats going around the Caribbean at the time, and they landed the Marines. They took over the bank, took over the land, rewrote the Constitution. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes the responsibility for that. He claims to have written it. There's some historical doubt about that, but he claims authorship of that particular Haitian Constitution, the main change in which was to allow foreigners to own land. And indeed, U.S. companies began to come into Haiti, setting up plantations to grow sugar, rubber, sisal, and other products. That occupation, which enslaved thousands, basically reinstituted slavery on the island in the form of what was called the corvée. They would take people who were called bandits, people who were fighting this occupation. There was a guerrilla leader who headed a group of guerrillas called the Cacos, called Charlemagne Perrault, and he fought them for about 3 years. He was finally captured and killed. They made the mistake of putting him on a door in a Christ-like pose to prove his death, but that only increased his renown and the sympathy. But the occupation essentially destroyed the resistance of the Cacos. In fact, many of the tactics that we saw in later wars, such as the war in Vietnam, were pioneered in Haiti. Aerial bombings, strategic hamlets, a lot of these things were pioneered in the Revolutionary War against the Haitians. In 1934, the U.S. had entered a Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt realized that it wasn't really feasible to keep troops over there with budget questions being what they were. This apparently hasn't occurred to Barack Obama yet. And in any case, you ended up having a withdrawal of U.S. troops. In 1957, there were a series of dictatorships, in essence, during that period. The U.S. left in place a thing called the Garde d'Haïti, the Guard of Haiti, which was a proxy force left there by the Marines to keep tabs on the country and keep it online. And essentially they did that until the arrival of, in 1957, of François Duvalier, known as Papa Doc. Papa Doc was really a representative of the Grandons. He realized he was a keen student of Machiavelli. If you ever read The Little Prince, you'll see a lot of his tactics were used. And he understood that really to deal with the army, the Garde d'Haïti, it had changed its name to the Armed Forces of Haiti, or the FAD, he had to develop a counterforce. And with that, he created a force called the Tonton-Macoutes, which were the eyes, ears, and fists of the regime. And they essentially put the army out of business and kept Duvalier in control, despite the fact that U.S. administrations were trying to sort of push him out. But this was during the Cold War, and Cuba was next door. And even though the U.S., both the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, and later the Nixon administration, were not completely happy with Papa Doc, but he was a ferocious anti-communist, and so they said, we better keep him there because he's at least keeping the lid on. But there was a lot of revolutionary upheaval. Duvalier named himself president for life, and he was indeed that until 1971 when he died, and he appointed his son, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier, as the dictator. But his regime began to unravel, especially as U.S. Approach to control in Latin America began to change in the 80s. They began to see that the placing of dictators in Latin America, in Haiti, in Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina, was actually not working because, one, they were often very corrupt, but two, they were creating lots of Che Guevaras. You had revolutionary struggles going on throughout Latin America with all kinds of people taking up arms against incredibly repressive and bloodthirsty dictators. And so they started to say, we better come up with a new paradigm. And that paradigm was essentially to say, we're going to have facade elections. We're going to put in place elected representatives who we will fund with vast amounts of money and publicity campaigns and send down all sorts of experts to help them gain power. And then we'll put the troops back in their barracks. And if there's a problem, we'll use an international force. We'll use the UN to come in and keep things in order. And that's essentially the formula that began to emerge. Jean-Claude was shown a plane and put on it, sent to a golden exile in France. And they had a hand-picked successor, a World Bank economist named Marc Bazin, who was sort of the anointed successor. He, unfortunately, when they removed Duvalier, it was a little bit letting a genie out of the bottle, and they couldn't get the genie back in the bottle. Now, the people, as one embassy employee once told me very memorably, the Haitian people got the idea that they could do whatever they want. So, indeed, they rejected Marc Bazin, they rejected all the dictators that the U.S. began to try to install to keep the lid on. And in 1990, 20 years ago, there was an election held. Marc Bazin was the leading candidate until about 4 weeks before, on the very day that the enrollment ended, a priest from one of the poorest slums in Port-au-Prince announced. That was Jean-Bertrand Aristide, Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Pandemonium swept the country. It was just a dream come true. The people had finally, after 2 centuries of being marginalized, of being kept out of the process, they had their candidate running, and it was a landslide. They even stopped the count when he had 67% of the vote out of many candidates. Marc Bazin, the runner-up, had only 13%. Jean-Bertrand Aristide became president. 1990. 1991, February 7th, he was sworn in. February 7th was the day Jean-Claude had left in 1986. So it had taken 5 years to finally seat a president. But he wasn't the president the U.S. wanted to see. And 7 months later, on September 30th, 1991, they fomented a coup against Aristide, CIA-backed, just as it had done in Chile and Dominican Republic and many other countries. And he was removed.